Great. This is the lecture on estuarine ecosystems as the final part of the Conservation 102 module for the third term. It'll be in two parts. So where do we find estuaries? First question, where do we find estuaries? Estuaries occur where freshwater ecosystems meet the sea. Freshwater ecosystems meet the sea. And you get an idea from this picture up top here that the way that the freshwater and the marine water interact is quite dynamic. Okay, so this is where rivers flowing down the landscape into the ocean where they meet. And the estuarine zone is where you have this potential for mixing. Okay, can you see that? This potential for mixing. This is a photograph of the Tugela River looking down towards the lower part of the Tugela River. And you can see there in the background is the sea. That over there is the sea. And you can see this brown water goes down and into the sea. Okay, so that's what an estuary is. It's that zone where freshwater ecosystems meet the ocean. Okay, if you look at our landscape again, our catchments, where are we talking about now? We're looking at this part over here. Eh? The estuaries are here, where freshwater flows into the ocean. Okay, you have that mixing zone. Estuaries are distinct ecosystems. So they're classified. Why do we not just say that there's a transition zone between rivers and the sea and we don't refer to it as a specific ecosystem? Well, estuaries are specific ecosystems because there's a lot of dynamics or features of estuaries that are specific or unique to that type of ecosystem. So an estuary doesn't just have freshwater things and it doesn't just have marine things. It has estuarine-specific species and estuarine-specific processes, which is why it's important for you guys to know what an estuary is, okay, and how it works. Always occurs at the lower end of rivers and includes the mouth of the river, which may be temporarily closed, where tidal influences from the sea affect the system. So because of the plain, you know, if you go back to the landscape, and you know that the river flows into the plain, so it's very flat, the topography is very flat. And remember, all the rivers are carrying a lot of sediment with them, eh? Remember we spoke about how the catchment erodes and you get the mobility or movement of sediments, and all of that sediment is being settling out. When it gets down into the plain and the flat areas, you get a lot of settling, a lot of sedimentation. And because of the lot of sedimentation, estuaries are always very sandy, or I can generalize, there's some of them that have got lots of rocky features, but because of all the deposition of sands, some of them deposit berms, they deposit sandbanks, which sometimes can stop them from always from the water flowing into the ocean. Especially during low flows, sometimes the water doesn't flow into the sea. The estuary itself is closed. It makes like a small dam, small lake at the bottom of the river. And that sometimes when the river is high, breaks out into the sea. Okay, so it can be temporarily closed. And tidal influences from the sea affect the system. So estuaries always have influences from the freshwater part and they have influences from the marine part. And when you have a storm surge, sometimes you have big storms out in the ocean and you have this big ability of the sea to surge into inland. And those, the influence can be as high as 5 meters. So we know that up to about 5 meters inland, the height 5 meters above sea level, is how far the potential influence of the sea can be. And sometimes, like in the Tugela estuary, which is the picture I showed you, the influence of the sea can be many kilometers upstream. Okay, so this river, you can see it's quite a large river and it flows into the sea. So the Tugela estuary is predominantly very fresh. It is referred to as a river mouth because it's slight elevation like the picture I've showed you. So you can see this mixing area is very limited in the Tugela estuary. But when there's a storm and the sea rises up and has a major influence on the Tugela, all of this part of the Tugela, in fact, past this point where the picture was taken, will be influenced by the marine environment. Okay, so that's quite characteristic of estuaries. They're very dynamic estuaries or very dynamic ecosystems where salt water from the sea mixes with fresh water from the river, resulting in varying concentrations of salts. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So from you guys who are doing zoo, you know that all the organisms that live in water have to regulate their salt concentrations in their bodies, osmoregulation. Well, what would happen if you lived in an environment where half of the day it's fresh and then the rest of the day it turns salty and it changes like this constantly? It would be very difficult and dynamic to live in an estuary. But they are species rich. They have many species in them. and organisms that are found in estuaries alone, and they're adapted to those conditions. Estuary communities composed of a mixture of endemic species. Endemic species refers to species that only occur in that type of ecosystem. So sometimes estuarine ecosystems are very limited between the freshwater environment and the sea, and you often get species that can only occur in that small zone. Can you say how vulnerable estuaries are? That if something happens and you remove the estuarine zone because of high floods, you could lose those species. If you do not allow sufficient water to join the sea and you have storm surge, you could remove the estuary as well. Okay, so it's very important. They're actually very important ecosystems for management as far as conservation is concerned. Estuarine communities are composed of endemic species, those coming from the sea, and a few freshwater species that are able to tolerate the varying saline conditions of the estuary. This, by the way, is in your manual. Okay, there's also some of the most productive ecosystems on the planet. Now, you would know already, if we go back to the topography or the catchment, you know that from the river continuum concept, you have allochthonous ecosystems in the top because they get their energy from outside the ecosystem. It comes from the surrounding forests in the form of debris. Remember, a lot of you guys asked me what debris was in the field. And then all of that energy flows downstream. But in the middle reaches, your production-respiration ratio is skewed towards production. So in the middle part of the ecosystem, because of the energy cycle, the middle part of the ecosystem produces more food than it uses, produces more energy than it uses. And all of that energy flows down into the lower part of the river where the estuaries are. So you're getting a lot of energy, a lot of nutrients coming from the middle reaches of the rivers that flow into the estuaries. And because the estuaries are flat and shallow and usually a lot warmer, there's a lot of opportunity for plants and other things to utilize that energy that's in the water. So estuaries are very productive, very productive. The two main factors, again, is the depth, the light penetration zone. They refer to it as the RCC. Don't worry, it's just the light penetration zone. And this is because with the estuaries occur on the plains and there's lots of sand deposition, they're usually quite wide and very shallow. Okay, and the ability for light then to penetrate down to the bottom is high. So you have a large area that has the potential for plants to grow. You see, that's why they're so productive. And when you get the primary producers, the plants are being produced, there's a lot of opportunity for things to eat by primary consumers and secondary consumers. Those things that then eat the plants and then eat each other. And then very importantly, the other thing is because of the nutrient concentrations which come from upstream, estuaries are called allochthonous ecosystems. And again, where does that come from? River continuum concept comes from upstream. Okay. The fauna and flora, plants and animals of estuaries need to be highly adapted to live in these saline and freshwater environments. Okay, we keep on referring back to that. Estuaries are very dynamic ecosystems, very difficult to live in estuaries because you have freshwater conditions, saltwater conditions, mixing conditions. And even when it mixes, it doesn't always mix together. Sometimes the top is fresh and the bottom is salt. You see? So they're very dynamic, very difficult ecosystems to live in. If you're an animal trying to regulate your salt, why? Because all organisms, they use the salt potential to move stuff between their cell membranes. So we need salt and we need a certain concentration of salt, and the differences in the concentrations allows us to move material within our bodies between cell membranes. Okay, so the salt concentration is very important for an organism, and it's very difficult if the salt concentration outside is going up and down all the time. There are many species like mangroves are good examples of organisms that are highly adapted to live in estuaries. Mangroves, mangrove trees. It's a type of tree that you usually find in the form of forests around these estuaries. Estuaries also act as conduits. What is a conduit? It's like a pipe that connects things. So estuaries are ecosystems that connect freshwater and marine ecosystems, which many anadromous and catadromous. Anadromous and catadromous species are different types of species, and you'll find out this out in zoo today, that migrate between freshwater and marine environments, or marine environments and freshwater ecosystems. Okay, so anadromous and catadromous migratory species, and they need access between these environments. So the estuaries and the quality of the estuary is important, because these species need to gain access between or through this ecosystem. And estuaries are always at the lower end of the river ecosystem, which means whatever is happening upstream, whether it be altered flows, water quality impacts, habitat modifications, or alien species, you generally get all of those problems occurring in the estuaries. Okay, so they're very vulnerable ecosystems. And the difficulty there is that if you're trying to have organisms and things move from freshwater to the marine environment, or the marine environment back into freshwater environments, you're always having to deal with these multiple stresses, all of these impacts that occur in estuaries. Okay, what's important about migratory species in South Africa? It's the anguillids. We have the highest diversity of anguillid eels. We're going to talk about that in zoo as well today. Estuaries provide nursery functions for marine migrant species, which are dependent on these ecosystems. So you can imagine, in the marine environment, it's a huge, giant fishbowl with millions of fish that just want to eat each other. So a lot of the fish know, especially a lot of the big growing marine species know, that if they go breed in the mixing zone of estuaries, and the water can push their larvae back into the estuary, then when the larvae, the little guys, are living in this shallow estuary that's got lots of vegetation in it, there's a greater opportunity for them to survive and grow compared to them being in the sea. So that nursery function of estuaries is very important. Okay, it allows us to maintain many species of fish in the sea. In fact, it's become so important that many, many, many species of fish in the sea are dependent on estuaries now, because that's the only place where, and they need that type of conditions to condition themselves to breed, so that their larvae then go into the estuaries. So if you didn't have that ecological cue, that trigger telling them to breed because you're close to an estuary, they wouldn't breed, and then we'd lose a lot of species. And many of those species are ecologically important. Okay, what I want to do now quickly is I just want to show you a quick video of the dynamics of, yeah, there we go. We'll come back here in a moment. So this is a short animation just to show you what it looks like when not going to work. There we go. So this is an animation to show you freshwater and marine relationship between the red is the sea, the salt water, and the blue is the freshwater. You can see how, based on different times, you can see what happens between the marine environment and the freshwater. And this happens with tides. So you can see when the tide's up, the marine environment pushes all the freshwater up, and then when the tide's low, the freshwater pushes it down. So this estuarine portion over here, and you can see, even if you look at the pictures, you can see that although the salinity of the ecosystem is changing constantly, you're also getting this pushing up. The water is being pushed back by the sea when the sea levels rise. So these mudflat areas that are inundated every day, the water comes up and inundates the mudflats and goes down. So from a bird perspective, from an invertebrate perspective, all of these different types of animals are adapted to these different types of ecosystems in estuaries. Okay, some species prefer this highly mixing zone because it's so dynamic and difficult to live in. Many species prefer that area because they're safe from other species. Some areas prefer the freshwater part of estuaries where they can get access to a lot of fish coming into the estuaries. Some species prefer these mudflat areas like birds, invertebrates, and things like that. So this is what what the dynamics of the estuary look like. And it does this day in, day out. And remember, there are 2 tides every day, so you can imagine that this type of inflow and outflow happens twice a day. Okay. And you can see from your mind, can you think of when the river floods, you don't get as much of this mixing, it pushes the river out. But when the river goes low, 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 because of low flows, for example, then the influence of the sea would be much greater. And during those periods, you might have the influence of the sea coming right up to here, this mixing zone. All right. Okay, let's go back to this. Okay, so there are three different types of estuaries. And these are the type of, this is the estuary classification system that we have established for South Africa. If you look internationally, they refer to fjords and they refer to other type of basins, but we don't have those. So we're really going to stick to the classification system we have for South Africa. And you can see what's important is these systems all occur in KZN. We have permanently open estuaries. Those are estuaries like the animation I showed you that don't close. You don't get the formation of sandberms. Then temporary open closed. Oh, that's a pity. This picture's, the label's right on top of the picture. Darn it. Can you see my cursor? Yeah, you can. So what you can't see here is, can you see at the bottom of this label here, there's just sand. So what happens is, because of the deposition of sand, in the next lecture I'll show you some more pictures of these type of estuaries. You can see that the sand comes down and it deposits the sand during low flow. There's still a little bit of water moving between the sand, between the freshwater environment into the sea. And importantly, when the sea rises up to the sand, the level of the sea is higher than the level of the estuary. So some salt water moves through the sand into the estuary. And what happens is, once the salt water is moved into the estuary, it doesn't necessarily come out because the sea level drops to the level of the estuary. So every time it rises, you get more salt water moving in, and it drops again. More salt water moving in, drops again. More salt water moving in. So these closed estuaries can actually become very, very, very salty. They can actually become saltier than the sea. Okay, because what happens in the estuary is the water is being evaporated, but you're always getting this new water coming in from the marine environment. Okay, so you know we're referring to the terms hyper and hypo. Hyper always refers to more or high. So hypersaline refers to it being extremely saline, extremely high salt concentrations. Hyposaline meaning that it's got very low concentrations of salt. So we often get these hypersaline conditions in estuaries where the marine environment causes the salt concentrations to go up and up and up and up. And then what we've also done is we've also transformed a lot of our estuaries, and you get these bay ecosystems where you have this huge bay and you get the mixing zone in this huge bay. And what we've done, that bottom picture just shows you, for example, the Durban Harbour, where we've created this artificial bay, and the river flows into the bay, and the mixing zone is actually in the bay. So the bay goes fresh and salt every day. Okay, the pictures on the right give you an idea of how the water can mix in estuaries, and the idea here is to show you that you can get these salt wedges that are forming. So here the idea is that the salt water comes from the left-hand side, and what we measure salt concentrations in is parts per million. So this little sign here refers to parts per million, and it's generally the same as the milligrams per liter. So we have about 33 milligrams per liter of salt, and you can see that this very salty water lifts up the fresh water, and you can see that there's this countercurrent issue going on here. Okay, so sometimes in estuaries, you'll measure the surface salt concentrations using conductivity, and it'll be fresh. And as you go down, you'll realize that at the bottom it's salty. So there's a salt wedge under you. And this is what it looks like. And it's because of the density, the relative density of the water is different between freshwater and salt and marine environments. Okay. Sometimes you do get better mixing. If you often get a river that has a lot of turbulence, turbulence will cause the water to mix. So depending on the shape of the mouth and the type of estuary, you may have better mixing. But you can see what they're trying to show you here is that salt water is always heavier than fresh water. So you do get this mixing, but you do get this slight formation of a wedge. When do we get this partially mixed and mixed conditions? Is when you have a lot of turbulence that causes the water to mix. And or if you don't get a lot of influence from the sea. So you can imagine these what we often do is, like in the animation I showed you, is we color the freshwater and the marine water in different colors, and we show that when they come together, the fresh water usually goes over the salt water if there's a lot of freshwater flow and there's a lot of influence from the sea. But if there's not a lot of influence from the freshwater in the marine environment, you don't get a lot of overflow. And if there's some turbulence, you get mixing. Okay. Great. Okay, that's about the same thing. Okay, and then in terms of our species, yeah, we have these different relationships between between the tolerances of species and their ability to sustain or their ability to tolerate salinities. And if you look in freshwater ecosystems, you can see that there's this general relationship between, I'm just going to show you with the cursor. So if you're looking at the number of species, can you see that the freshwater species generally decreases as you move towards higher salinities? And you can see that you have a very few number of species that are called freshwater stragglers. So what is a straggler? If you guys, how many of you guys can swim? Put your hands up. How many of you can swim well? Like you can swim 100 meters across an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Hey? Yeah. You know that some people, when you do triathlons, I used to do triathlons. Can you believe it? I did triathlons for Zimbabwe. I represented Zimbabwe and did triathlons. We would then swim a kilometer. Can you swim a kilometer? So that means, can you imagine, you've swum 500 meters, 700 meters, and now you're in trouble. You're straggling. You're in trouble. You're not happy. You don't like the situation you're in. Okay, that's what we consider to be these stragglers. So these freshwater stragglers, and you can see here, as the salinity concentrations increase, remember this symbol refers to parts per million, and it's very similar to completely salt water is 35 milligrams per liter, or 35 parts per million. So it's the same as milligrams per liter. Estuaries do things, people from estuaries just do everything different to the rest of the world. They don't even refer to the sites as sites, they refer to their sites as stations. They'll say that my whole estuary is my site, and I have different sampling stations within the estuary. We refer to sites generally, but anyway, it's a bit of an interesting community. So you can see what happens is these freshwater species, as the salinity tolerance increases, the species that have freshwater species that have some ability to tolerate salt water can go into that saltwater environment, can go and eat up all the babies, for example, and when it gets too salty, they must come back. They must retreat. So sometimes if you're sampling in an estuary, you may catch these tilapia, Mozambique tilapia, and you'll think, what are you doing in the estuary? And often what happens is they're coming in to feed, and they're going to get out as soon as the concentrations get too high. Okay. Then from the marine perspective, you have the same thing. So you have a lot of marine species that prefer very high saline conditions, and as the water starts to get fresh, you get this issue of marine stragglers coming into estuaries, and a lot of those species are lost. You'll say, what are you doing here? You're lost. And that's why, for example, we've caught Zambezi sharks in the Kruger. What the hell is a Zambezi shark doing in the Kruger? It had to swim 200 kilometers through Mozambique before it comes into the Kruger. It's definitely lost. And you can see that they can occur in freshwater for a while, but they're not very happy. They don't like it, and they retreat back into the marine environment. Do you guys know what a mullet is? A mullet, harder, mullet. It's a very common marine fish that people use for food. It's very popular, very common in the lowland parts of rivers and in the sea. And I have a colleague from Zimbabwe who contacted me a few years ago to say he's found this new alien species and he cannot ID it. What is it? And it was a mullet that had swum again through Mozambique into Zimbabwe, and he collected a few, and he was so worried that he thought it was an alien species. Meanwhile, this is a marine straggler that's just been able to swim through all of Mozambique into Zimbabwe. Okay. And then what's important here is to show you this band here, is that you get this endemic group of species. They call it brackish water species, but they're estuarine species. So we refer to euryhaline species. Euryhaline species are species that have got a wide tolerance for salinity changes. Euryhaline, whatever. The eury part of the word refers to it has a broad tolerance of salinities, where the stenohaline tolerances refer to a narrow range. And the stenohaline species are those that are marine species. Okay, so it just gives you an idea of the euryhaline are these guys that are very tolerant to changes in salinity concentrations, and the stenohaline are those that prefer salty water. They don't have a lot of tolerances. Okay, I'm just going to refer to some issues around estuaries in South Africa. So we have about 300 estuaries and another 200 or inlet or river inlets or outlets. And the idea there is that, so of the 500 or so river mouths, about 300 of them are characterized or classified, they're all classified as estuaries. But based on the size of an inlet or outlet, if it's just a drainage outlet, which is a seasonal stream, they weren't really classified as an estuary that should be managed. So this is from a management context. And what's important here is that because of the temperate regions around South Africa, temperate is like the warm, cold, or subtropical regions of South Africa, we have these different zones. So we have these subtropical estuaries, and the subtropical estuaries, my cursor's gone again. Okay, so these are the subtropical estuaries in South Africa, and they have certain characteristics based on their temperatures. Then these temperate estuaries, warm temperate estuaries, are these ones down at the bottom here. Warm temperate is actually a very silly word because it's counterintuitive. Temperate means cold and warm is warm. So why would you put warm and temperate together? It's just because we want to show that there's a transition area between the cold, cool temperate and the subtropical. So on the southern coast of South Africa, you get this group of estuaries that have got a high variability of temperatures, warm and cold. So we call them warm temperate ecosystems. You can see in terms of the amount of area relative to the other type of estuaries, in terms of the tropical estuaries, you can see some of the estuaries are large, like St. Lucia, these estuaries up here, and especially in on the west coast, we have some large estuaries. Some of the very small, medium-sized, you can just get an idea of what is the distribution of the sizes of estuaries in the tropical, warm temperate, and cool temperate regions. And you can see that they're all dominated by the smaller estuaries. They're dominated by smaller estuaries. But some of them have got these different moderate to large estuaries, especially here the large estuaries. And those large estuaries are very productive, very important ecosystems that maintain huge diversities, abundances of animals. So it's very important from a conservation perspective that you know where they occur and whether or not you should be protecting them. By the way, what's not shown here is the Mozambican estuaries, and we actually know very little about them. We know very, very little about the Mozambican estuaries. Okay, this is a map to show you the differences in the threats, high, medium, and low threat of flow modifications, fishing pressure, bait collection, pollution, habitat degradation, and infrastructure development on our estuaries. And you can see infrastructure development by far is one of the major concerns pertaining to estuarine ecosystems. They're beautiful places, and what people generally do is they come in, they transform the estuaries, they build it up, and as a result that poses a threat because the estuary is not functioning naturally anymore. Some of these people who develop estuaries, they no longer want the estuary to function because they're worried about their property. So they're building walls and they're building berms and they're isolating or separating estuaries, which is a big problem. Infrastructure, bait collection is a major issue as well. Fishing pressure, habitat degradation. You can see how the KZN estuaries, hey? The KZN estuaries are being hammered by infrastructure, habitat, and pollution. Water quality contamination itself is a major, major driver. We're almost there, guys. So this is the legend, the map to show you what is the ecological integrity of most estuaries around the country. And you can see, unfortunately, so there are lots of estuaries that are relatively small, which are still in a pristine condition, but we do have very serious issues with estuaries being overutilized, exploited, and it being in an unsustainable condition. Estuaries are some of our most vulnerable ecosystems in South Africa. Okay, it's a big problem that we're trying to deal with. And a lot of work has been done. We have identified the estuaries, we've classified the estuaries, we've identified these priority ecosystems. And unfortunately, a lot of the larger ecosystems that are vulnerable to altered flows, that are vulnerable to water quality contamination from upstream, there are also those estuaries that are being excessively harvested for natural products. They maintain high biodiversities of species, so they're very important to us, and protecting them is vital. Alrighty. Guys, that is it for today.